Yeah, I'm Stephanie Frischi. I am an agronomist and native plant materials specialist with the Xerces Society. I am based in West Central Indiana, but I get to work locally and across the continent and around the world on a lot of different projects related to native plants and habitat creation or management. So today we're here to have a virtual learning circle on habitat for pollinators, planning, sourcing, and planting. But I've got a little switch to hit you guys with here right away. We actually, this is the first learning circle in a series, and we're going to talk about planting on June 7th. So what we meant to say when we advertised the event today was planning, sourcing, and site prep. So that's our focus for today. And then coming up in March, we're going to talk about community science, ways you can become involved and learn more both about pollinators and contribute to the understanding of them, planting in June. And then in September, we're going to check in with each other again with another circle, kind of looking back at the growing season and looking ahead to the fall and winter seasons. So I've got a lot to cover in just an hour today, but overall, we'll talk about insect pollinators, habitat planning, big overview, some site prep pointers, then suggestions on where you can get the seeds and plants, so you can be including those thoughts in your plans, and then resources. And then, like Heather said, we'll have a little more time for discussion at the end, but also mixed among things here. So this is our first chance to kind of everyone participate who would like to using the chat. So you should have a little toolbar with a little speech bubble, and it says the word chat. And if you click on that, you should be able to send a message to everyone. Just let us know where you're joining from today. What is the reason or reasons that you're participating in today's learning circle, and how do you hope to grow either by learning or sharing with others in today's circle? So I'll give everyone just a moment to share what they would like to share in the chat. And I put a view here. This is what I'm seeing out my window today here in West Central Indiana. It's one of those good, dreary, wet, thawing winter days. It's always nice to enjoy nature and where we are in the present, but it's exciting to kind of feel the soil warming up. I heard red-winged blackbirds starting to call around their territories in the past few days, so you can just, feel where we are in the seasonal year. Okay, we've got folks from Vermilion County hoping to make my yard pollinator friendly. Greenwood, Indiana, here to plant flowers to attract bees and butterflies in the local area. From Fort Wayne, Indiana, from Hope, Indiana, attending a beekeeper training next weekend and looking to plant flowers this spring around my garden. Someone from Greenfield, Indiana, has moved here from Virginia and wants to learn about the differences in planting between Virginia and Indiana. And also in the Indiana area, someone with an acre of pollinator habitat, another beekeeper looking to provide early season and late season pollen in Montgomery County. Great, well, welcome everyone. Thank you for sharing. And here is Gwen, who's from Oxford. And hi, Gwen, looking to plant her yard to pollinators. I've been working with Gwen here locally too. All right, if anyone wants to add, continue using the chat. Heather's going to help monitor that, and we'll check that from time to time here. So let's see. All right, I'll go through some of these things quickly. Again, it's more of an overview and to just get us thinking about them rather than to dive in too deeply. But this is a graph of all the animals in the world, And insects are just this huge group of all the different species of animals that there are. So they are small but mighty. And really the fate of the world's insects is inseparable from our own. They're important in nutrient cycling and decomposition in our soil ecology. They are eating and feeding themselves and their young, and they eat a lot of other insects. So that's a type of natural pest control and balance. They also, insects turn plants into food for other animals. So, birds have a lot of variation in their diet, but for many species, the chicks are really growing and they need protein. And the parents are feeding them primarily insects like this bluebird here with a caterpillar larvae. So that caterpillar has eaten plants and turned it into a high protein meal for a bird family. The pollination that insects do also turns plants into food for us, like blueberries, for example. And then they also help plants reproduce through pollination. We'll mostly talk about pollinators, but here's just an overview of some of those other insects that are they're predators. Some of the other natural enemies. They may have one life stage where they're primarily a predator, but then another life stage where they're visiting a flower and acting as a pollinator too. So I included those for that reason. If we just talk about the 6 main groups of invertebrate pollinators, those are all insects. So we've got butterflies, moths, flies, and then in the bottom row there, an example of a beetle, a wasp, and a bee. And, like I said, sometimes, so this little slide is an aphid being eaten by the larvae of the fly. That fly that's in the upper right corner, that's the adult. And this is what it looks like when it's a young larva. And it's a predator as a larva, but a pollinator as an adult. So bees, of all those groups of insect pollinators, bees are the most important. And the reason for that is bees are actively seeking pollen for their young. So, the adult bees are gathering nectar and pollen. They take it back to their nest where they've laid eggs, and then those eggs hatch and they have little larvae, young, and they're caring for them by bringing them back this pollen and nectar as food. So like bees are intentionally visiting flowers to gather that food and move pollen around. This is a chart showing just a snapshot of some of the bee diversity. We've got more than 4,000 bee species in North America. That little sliver at the top that's circled in red is the honeybee, one species, which, honeybees are amazing, but they're kind of like livestock. They're a European species that has been managed and semi-domesticated by humans for thousands of years. So this just shows where they are in relation to all these thousands of other native bee groups and species that are here in North America. So one way to start to organize and think about these native bees is through their nesting behavior. So 1%, like the bumblebees are about 1% of our native bees, and they are semi-social also, and they kind of make these pots out of a type of wax, and their nests are in cavities. So that's on the left. On the top, we see an example of a stem or a tunnel nesting bee. That's in a constructed nesting box, but in nature, they would find other hollow tubes like the pithy hollow stems of plants. And about 30% of our native bee species nest that way. But the majority, about 70%, actually nest in little tunnels and chambers underground. So on the soil surface, they can kind of look like an ant nest. They could be found, in turf or vegetation, but most often they're in places where the soil's more bare or open. And often then, because the bees are excavating this, it's usually a lighter textured soil, but they can nesting clay as well. Here's an example of some of the tunnel nesting bee species and how their nest works. So they kind of go in and first, lay an egg. They partition that off with either mud, leaf pieces, or sawdust. They make these separate series of chambers in that tube, and each one has its own little egg where the mother bee has put the pollen food for that bee to eat once it hatches as a larvae, and then it will pupate, and then once it's done with that stage, it chews its way out and becomes an adult. Bumblebees also, this is where several generations, kind of similar to honeybees, are helping take care of subsequent generations throughout the year, but there are a lot fewer individuals than in a honeybee colony. And they're looking for a hollow cavity. So this could be in abandoned rodent burrows in the ground, or in brush piles, or grass litter or tree cavities. So we've got all these amazing insects, yet research, wherever it's been studied, insect diversity is declining. So we're seeing species loss and loss of number of individuals. If you look at the main causes for that, there are these 4 big categories: habitat loss, pesticides, disease and non-native species, and then climate change. And the words at the bottom of each arrow really look at the action, or how we can address each of these threats. So most of what we'll talk about today, fits in one of these 4 action categories. Okay, so today we're talking about the planning and the site prep phase. These are all things that are going to be unique to your particular project or situation for you to think about, these building blocks in your planning. What's the size or the scope of this project? It could be as small as just one container on your balcony or your patio. It could be hundreds or thousands of acres, and then anywhere in between. Is it located in an urban setting or a rural setting? Is it located near other agriculture? Is it located near some natural areas? All those types of considerations. What are your specific goals for the project? What's your budget? What's your timeline? Is this going to just happen in a few weeks? If it's a much simple project, that's certainly feasible. If it's a larger project, it could certainly take years. Who are the people or partners that you're also working with on this? What tools or equipment do you need, and do you have access to, or how can you get those tools? Knowledge, guess that means both your own knowledge and understanding, as well as reaching out, for printed information, information online, or connecting with other technical resource experts around you. And then also you want to keep in mind what your plans and options are for stewardship, for taking care of the site and managing it after you've planted it. You don't just plant it and walk away. You'll need to be watching for weeds, watching for the plants that you planted grow, watching for the kinds of pollinators and other wildlife that you hope to attract, and just kind of keep it going on the path that gets you towards your goal. So if we look at, again, I did that intro to some of these pollinators and their life cycles so that we get a better sense of how to think about planning habitat for them. So these 4 general components: they need food sources. They need nectar and pollen throughout the growing season, from spring through fall. And then for butterflies and moths, again, the adults of those are often feeding on nectar, but the caterpillar stage, those larvae, are feeding on plants. So they need host plants. And the monarch, is a great example of that. The caterpillars can only feed and grow on milkweed species, whereas the adult butterflies can visit and should have a more diverse diet of nectar sources. Our pollinators need shelter, so that includes appropriate sites for nesting as well as for overwintering, and places where they can, be healthy and have protection from disease and competition from managed bees. Where and if possible, connectivity is important. Some habitat is still better than no habitat. So even if you feel like your habitat is really small or isolated, every little bit helps to build and connect habitats. And then I'll talk a little bit more about, protection from pesticides, whether we're in an urban area or rural areas. We've got kind of different sources of pesticides that can come and impact the plants and the insects in our habitat in a negative way or an undesirable way. So like I showed, before, we're kind of here in winter, but we're dreaming or planning for the growing season here. And I think it's good to use winter time. We're probably all planning our vegetable gardens and flower gardens for the year. And so it's a really important and appropriate time to think about planning for pollinator habitat as well. Again, this just shows that, even though we don't see pollinators, they're here. They're hiding either as eggs or adults or pupae, depending on the species. They're here in our landscapes this time of year. Here's just a quick example. This is a spring view, but it's even before a lot of flowers have started to bloom, but showing where some of those sheltering or nesting sites are for our pollinators. So again, providing plants that have litter, that have hollow stems, keeping areas with bare soil. Remember that grasses are pollinator plants, and that dead trees and limbs and branches are also pollinator plants. I think, in another month or so, it'll start getting warm and you get tempted to start cleaning up your garden. But it's good to wait until temperatures are consistently in the 50s and you start to see insects flying around. Otherwise, if you're picking up and discarding some of those materials, you're throwing out your pollinators, with those. So if you do need to clear out some areas, do it gently, and maybe rather than throwing it away or burning it or smashing it, if you have the space in your yard to kind of make a big loose compost pile, that can be a way to provide this kind of shelter and habitat for pollinators. I am gonna skip going into a lot of detail on this. This will be included in our resources here, but this is just reminding us that in some of our planning plant choices to think about species that have hollow stems that will provide nesting sites for those types of bees. And we tend to promote this message more in the fall, but I just kind of gave the early spring version of it. Leaves are not litter. They're food and shelter for butterflies, beetles, bees, moths, and more. So, and as much as you can clear leaves around your home or prevent them from getting too deep, but keep some of them as a shelter is a good recommendation. Right. We're mostly, we're entirely going to focus here on native plants. There's so much diversity around those. Most of them are perennials, but there are some annuals as well. And they're just a great investment because each individual will live for many years or even decades. And they can be self-sustaining in terms of you can collect seeds and continue to sprinkle them, or, they're made to really survive and thrive on their own. So they'll keep perpetuating themselves in your habitat also. And here's an example of some of the different there are bee specialists, also. So this spiderwort shown on the left is a plant that doesn't produce nectar. It only produces pollen. So that's a great bee plant, but not a great butterfly plant. Whereas if we look at rough blazing star, that one's kind of an example in the opposite direction. The nectar there just seems so sweet and attractive, especially to butterflies. And the shape of that flower is more, there's lots of individual flowers in that cluster. So each butterfly can get their straw-like mouth part down into those flowers that are tube shaped and full of nectar at the bottom. Butterfly milkweed on the center left is, again, one of the native milkweed species that supports monarchs. That's really showy. It's one of the few orange flowered native species we have. And it supports like these tiny bees that we're seeing, as well as up to big bumblebees, butterflies, flies, beetles. You know, go look at a milkweed flower up close and you'll just always get to see lots of different insects on there. And then things like sneezeweed, other sunflowers, goldenrods, asters, those are great. They keep blooming well into the fall, and they help bees kind of get their final meal before they go into overwintering mode. We have also, you know, a good reminder here of trying to plant for a diversity of seasons. And, you know, the reasons are you're getting different bees at different times. Not all bees are out and active for the entire season. So some are really active in the early spring, some are active later in the year. So that's why that diversity across seasons is important. And if you just, you know, think of all the different shapes of flowers, types of root systems, and, you know, we get more diversity of beauty in these, but it makes them much more resilient and functional types of habitat as well. This is a nice, it's not, I mean, it's organized sort of as a flow chart or a hierarchy here, but you can just think of these as these bigger functional groups. So grasses and sedges, in the green or the left-hand boxes there are cool season grasses that are more actively growing during the cooler, like the spring and into early winter. Warm seasons are the ones that get quite big and flower in late summer. And then sedges and rushes look grass-like, but for botanists, you know, if you look at them really closely, they're quite distinct. And these again are not really producing, these are wind pollinated. So they're not a great source of food for pollinators, but they're really important in habitat because of that litter structure or for nesting sites. And also they're just a balance of what nature would have. You know, nature wouldn't just have the most showy, hottest colored flowers. The grasses and sedges are part of that matrix. And then looking at forbs and wildflowers, some legumes or things in the pea family, and different choices you can make around non-legumes. And then, of course, woody species, shrubs and trees. Some of those are wind pollinated, but many of them are also pollinator friendly plants and great things to include in the habitat project. This is a beautiful slide, you know, that just, I think, accentuates all this diversity, just of the flowers of some of these plants that are native here to Indiana. And again, just echoing some of these different groups to consider. Willows are really great to include. You may have those occurring wildly on your property already, but they're a great source of pollen for really, really early in the spring as well. Yeah, so you can use, you know, nature to kind of help build your plan. So this tip is to select the woody species first. You may only have, you know, one or a few trees and then a few more shrubs, and then fill that in with some of the grass-like plants and the forbs. Here's an example that's a bit more of a formal planting, you know, showing how shrubs have been included with the bunch grasses, with the pollinator or the perennial wildflowers. Like here, for example, again, is butterfly weed, that orange flowered milkweed. And, you know, there's a closer up shot of how grasses are important as habitat too. Another example from one of my colleagues in Minnesota shows this before and after at a library project. So, again, you can see how grass heavy this planting is, yet there's still all these different wildflower groups that have been included. And you can also see how the topography here, there's some water and drainage, and rainwater here kind of ran straight into a storm sewer and then into the river. But what they've done with this planting is really slowed the water down, and it infiltrates and can enter the soil there, instead of carrying all this sediment into the river. So there's just another view of how they've incorporated some of the woody perennials and the grasses and sedges with wildflowers. Just turf grass, though, is turf grass by itself. It's not the best pollinator habitat because it's lacking a lot of those floral resources. There are many different ways you can reduce the amount of turf in your lawn and either expand it into full-on flowers and longer grasses for pollinators, or make it into a more diverse fruit or vegetable garden, like is pictured here. And whether you have sun or shade, I think a lot of times we default to those sunny prairie plants in our pollinator habitat, and those are great. There are also a lot of native plants that are woodland plants that are also great for home landscaping and pollinator habitat. So this is wild geranium, sort of the lavender colored flowers here, and then wild columbine are those coral colored flowers. So if you're in an urban area, of course, you may be working on your own home or a community or neighborhood project. There's lots of different places or opportunities for pollinator habitat in urban areas. This is a Xerces resource, which I think is a great tool. So I want to encourage each of you to seek this out. It's going to be in our references package that Heather will send out as a follow-up to today. But like roughly 20 pages, and it walks you through your project site, and it's asking you to consider all these aspects of pollinator habitat. Kind of what do you have now, and it tells you how to score. You give yourself points for each of these, and then it's really a good way to get you thinking and looking at your landscape and putting together a plan for how you might plant some things, some additional things or differently, or how you might manage your habitat differently. And then you can go back a year later or, at different time points later and score yourself again. Just kind of see, how you've changed things and how you can continue to find opportunities to improve the habitat value of that. All right, that was focused a little bit more on yards and urban areas. Now I'm going to switch more to rural and farm landscapes, but I just want to pause here and see if there's any questions or comments right now. I don't see anything in the chat, but feel free to speak up. Okay. Everyone's listening right now. Very good. All right. So now we're looking more here at this diverse farmscape, or here's an illustration of that, and just looking at some of the opportunities there are to improve the value of pollinator habitat here. You may have some natural areas or fallow or uncultivated land. You can use cover crops. Within your agronomic cropping system, you can put in buffers along waterways or creeks or rivers. You can also put a lot more flowering plants in the hedgerows or roadsides. Your gardens are a place for pollinator habitat. And again, some of those brush or little litter piles like we talked about before. And also just recognizing that some bare ground is also desirable. I want to mention the Natural Resource Conservation Service. as another great source of information for like technical guidance as well as planning and for cost share. So every county has a local office, and this is another great place to visit or start, especially if you have farmland. They can help you see what types of programs and options are available with funding from the federal government to create or enhance pollinator habitat. So I have a few slides here just showing some examples of these. So like Field Border Practice 386 is one of these programs available through NRCS. And you can just see, what a nice enhancement of pollinator habitat. There's tree and shrub plantings, another practice 612. They put elderberry in here along this hedgerow, which has hollow stems, as well as a lot of berries for wildlife and the flowers for pollinators. The inset photo is the grapevine, which also are hollow and can be used as nesting sites. The EQIP programs address a lot of different natural resource concerns, and it's a way to do a really diverse prairie plant pollinator planting like shown in the foreground here. I think, in the interest of time, I'm going to go through these fairly quickly, but these are some of the things that NRCS staff can help with, are these planning steps. So they can see where these different programs might fit on different parts of your farm and help you get enrolled and set up to do those. Okay, so another part of habitat and pollinator conservation is pesticide protection. So sometimes this is rather obvious, the pesticide, whether that's insecticide, fungicide, or herbicide, it's applied in a spray, but these small droplets are then airborne and can lead to drift, where the pesticide moves to adjacent areas that were not what were originally targeted. So one way to protect it is just with distance, but you can get even better protection if you put this kind of a buffer. And here it's a vegetative barrier, and you can see there's a conifer kind of tree, maybe some other evergreen shrubs. But again, those are wind pollinated species, so they're less attractive to pollinators. And if some drift does get on those trees, they're less likely to be coming in direct contact with the pollinators that are more likely to be visiting vegetation that has a lot of flowers and things. So a spatial and or a vegetative barrier is one suggestion there. Also in our farmland, neonicotinoids, they're much safer for a lot of other kind of wildlife, but they're much more deadly for insects. And the use of those in our crops has increased enormously, in recent decades. They're often used as seed treatments as well. So, that's something else if you're making the decisions or working with your tenant farmer, is to just understand all the different ways that some of these pesticides might be being used or applied to the field. So, even if bees or pollinators are not around when the pesticide application occurs, these other types of exposures can happen. They might be there and get directly sprayed, or they might be coming, cutting up part of leaf off to make that nest partition, but that leaf has an insecticide on it, and now they carry it back to their nest and inadvertently, harm or kill the young that they're raising there. And then also that last slide is showing just how some pesticides, move through water, and therefore they move throughout the soil and water table as well. Conservation Stewardship Program is another one. Conservation Reserve Program. So yeah, that was just a quick run through of a lot of these programs that are available if you've got large acreage or agricultural land. So again, just summarizing up planting here, try to find a location that's going to be low pesticide risk or manage the way pesticides are used in or around it. Try to connect to other habitat, look at a lot of plant diversity, and then also provide those nesting and overwintering sites. Keep the size of your project in mind, and some of your other goals. Like, are you really doing this just for monarchs? Are you doing it for specialist bees, for bumblebees? You can have all kinds of pollinators, but if you have a specific focus, that will guide some of your choices. Also, does it matter what it looks like to you? And then that post stewardship, like options, how long are you keeping this habitat? Who's going to be taking care of it? What types of practices or tools will be needed? Is it going to be used for education? Those kinds of things. There's also this little maxim to keep in mind with timelines, is that if you are planting these perennials by seed, they're not going to be like zinnias that are blooming 8 weeks later. So the first year they sleep, the second year they creep, and the third year they leap. And that's just an easy way to remember that the first year of seeding, a lot of those seeds are just losing dormancy, and they may be germinating, but they'll be really small. The second year, they're still there, they're still growing, but they're focusing on building up their underground reserves and resources. And then the third year is when they have the energy and the reserves to start to put on a lot of leaves and flowers. Okay, anything else in the chat or comments here? I'm gonna just finish up here then on the last few sections of the talk, and hopefully leave 10 minutes for more discussion or questions at the end. Okay, site preparation. I know it's really exciting to think about what species we're going to plant and then to do the planting, but I can't emphasize the importance of site preparation enough. Once you've planted things, you've then committed to that investment, and you have to let go of a lot of your management options. You can't use herbicide as freely or widely now because you don't want to kill what you've planted. So it's important to get the site ready, as ready as possible ahead of time, and know what weed pressure to expect, either that might be coming in from adjacent areas or that's in the soil you're working with. Another important aspect of site preparation is preparing the seed bed. You want it to have it be that when you plant these seeds, you're not going to plant them very deeply. A lot of these natives just need to be planted on the surface, or just a smidge underneath the soil. But you want them to be in good seed to soil contact, so you don't want a lot of litter or uneven ground there. And then if it's a smaller project, you may be able to do this with a rake and just by spreading the seed and then kind of scratching it back in. Or if it's a much larger project, you'll be using tractors and other implements and seeders and things. Another resource that we'll share is this great handbook on organic site preparation. And there's a nice chart here that shows some of the different methods, when to use them, when not to use them, and how they work, and the equipment that you need. So there's solarization, there's smother cropping. You can do repeated shallow cultivation, or tillage, sheet mulching, soil inversion, or then organic herbicides and sod removal. So you could also use things like livestock and grazing and burning, if those options are available to you as well. Solarization is where you prepare the area, and then you actually put down this big sheet of transparent plastic, and you leave it there for several months, and you just let the heat of the sun to help cook just, can't go very deep. It won't cook very deeply, but it's cooking the top inch or so of soil and, killing any weed seeds or small seedlings that germinate there. So that's good if you have a linear place, if you have access to this plastic, or if it's a fairly, small area. Smother cropping is basically another form of cover cropping where you're trying to just manage which plants are growing there, and you use these smother crops to outcompete some of the non-desirable weeds that you might have. You can also use this repeat tillage or cultivation if you have that equipment and it's appropriate to your site. The goal there again is to get this flush of weed seeds germinated and then till them again so they die, and repeat that a couple times. So you can see how this needs to happen over several months, if in at least a year in advance of when you might want to actually do your planting. Sod removal is another option when we're looking at yards and turf areas that are small enough. And then you can fill those in either by seeding or with transplants. You can use conventional herbicides or organic herbicides to weaken or kill the patch or the field that you want to plant. And then sheet mulching, there are different ways to do this. You can use corrugated cardboard, you can use wheat straw, other types of kind of mulching materials where you just put that on so thickly that you're kind of preventing, anything from germinating. And again, this will be something you'll do a year or more, in advance of preparing the site. All right, we're getting here into the last few sections here on sources for seeds and plants. So yeah, again, your kind of budget, your project size, your timeline will help determine whether you're using seeds or plants. Seeds, of course, are more inexpensive upfront, but it takes longer to kind of get the plants to their full size. Plants are more expensive upfront, but you get a bigger plant sooner. And you can also control the spacing and can manage weeds a little bit more easily. Which species, we talked about that a lot in the beginning, as far as some of the choices to make. Ecotype is a term that refers to more like a species might grow all over the Midwest, but the weather in northern Minnesota is different than the weather in southern Indiana. So local populations have adapted somewhat to those climate differences. So for a project that you want to be successful or last for decades, you may want to source more local seeds because they're adapted to that specific location. And then your budget and who are some of the different suppliers to look at. Again, with native plants, Indiana has a lot of nurseries and companies specialized in native seeds. The Indiana Native Plant Society has a directory online. It's their By Natives directory. And this is just a screenshot of that, but they list kind of the permanent businesses that are open, whether they're wholesale or retail. And all those yellow dots are marking the seasonal sales. So many organizations in April and May, they have a weekend or an event that's a sale for native plants. So I'd recommend consulting this website and seeing when there's going to be a local plant sale later this spring near you and marking your calendar for that. Xerces has a pollinator conservation resource center. For Indiana, we're in that light blue Great Lakes region. And when I finish the presentation, I'm going to just share my screen and go through the website real quickly to show you all the resources that you can access through that website. It includes, I'll talk about that at the end. Xerces also has a milkweed finder tool where you can go online. This is for the whole country, but you can, choose it for your state or location and what species you're looking for. And it will pull up different suppliers who offer that either as seeds or as plants. And then Xerces is also launching in March this National Native Plant Seed and Services Directory. So that's bigger and beyond just milkweeds, but it will be this nationwide database where you can apply different filters and help find more suppliers around you. Also, it's possible to introduce pesticides unwittingly when you're sourcing your plants. So we also have some guidance on simple steps for buying bee-safe plants, and that includes seeking out organic plants or seeds to begin with, avoiding plants that are going with neonicotinoids or other similar systemic insecticides. And when you're making your purchase, ask the seller or your nursery what steps they take to offer plants that are grown, using pollinator-friendly pest management. Xerces has two fact sheets available about this. So both from the consumer side, like guidance to help you buy bee-safe plants, and then from the producer side, how growers and retailers can improve their offering of bee-safe plants. Okay, quickly then I'll go through a summary here of resources. I'm with the Xerces Society for Invertebrate Conservation, and I hope you'll consider me and our organization a resource. We're nationwide and we work around the world, and we're the largest pollinator conservation habitat organization. We also focus on endangered species, pesticide management, aquatic invertebrates, and policy advocacy and outreach as well. We have a ton of publications that are available for free download on our website. I talked about a few of those today. And again, when Heather sends out the follow-up, we'll send a link to some of these. Our website also includes these regional pollinator plant guides. So, we went through a little more detail today, but these are a great place to get some starting lists of ideas that are for species that would be great to put in your pollinator habitat. I talked about this assessment guide already. We have several books that you can buy wherever you like to buy books, or if you become a Xerces member, you can choose one of these as your thank you gift. And these are a few other great books that are not written by Xerces, but which I like to suggest. And I think Heather already has some of these in our resource list also. Heather Holmes' books are also great. They're really appropriate for the Midwest, and those will be in the resource book. They talk both about the plant attributes as well as which pollinators are associated with those plants. And Heather's website also has some really nice suggested plant lists, both the forbs and trees and shrubs. Xerces has a YouTube channel with all kinds of great, hour-long or so courses and presentations on all kinds of topics. So we have gardening for invertebrates, gardening for pollinators, using native plants in your garden. So please look at our YouTube channel and other social media. Remember that your NRCS office and staff are also a great resource for you. I'd like to thank all of our Xerces members and Heather and Women for the Land and Karen, my coworker, for a lot of her contributions to these same topics and slides. And just let everyone know that Xerces is a member organization. So you can also join us if you would like, or please check out our website. And with that, I will remind everyone to be the change, and thank you for being here today and your interest in pollinators and pollinator habitat.
Thank you, Stephanie. That was a lot of great information. really appreciate your time. I'm going to stop the recording and we can continue our conversation and ask more questions of Stephanie.